Space, the final frontier. This is the Observer's Notebook, the official podcast of the Association of Lunar and Planetary Observers. Its mission to explore the solar system, to seek out new observations and data, to boldly go where no podcast has gone before. And now the host of the Observer's Notebook, Tim Robertson.
Hello and welcome to episode 210 of the Observer's Notebook, the official podcast of the Association of Lunar and Planetary Observers. I am Tim Robertson, the host of the Observer's Notebook and also the coordinator of the training program within the ALPO. Thanks for downloading and listening. The Association of Lunar and Planetary Observers collects and analyzes observations of various solar system bodies and associated phenomenon, and publishes detailed reports concerning these bodies in its quarterly publication, the Journal of the Association of Lunar and Planetary Observers. This podcast depends upon donations from you, our listeners, to keep it going. If you enjoy what you hear in the podcast, you can donate to it via Patreon. You can start off by giving as little as $1 a month. If you feel even more generous, for $5, you receive early access to the podcast before it goes public. For a monthly donation of $10, you receive a copy of the Novice Observer's Handbook. And for $35 a month, you receive producer credits on the podcast. You can find out more by going to www.patreon.com/observersnotebook. If you'd like to join the ALPO, membership begins at only $22 a year. For more information, find us at www.alpo-astronomy.org. And you can also find the ALPO on Facebook. Just search for ALPO Astronomy. And yes, this podcast also has a Facebook page as well. Just search for Observer's Notebook. And if you enjoy what you hear in the podcast, please subscribe. That way you'll never miss another episode. And now, a very exciting episode of the Observer's Notebook where we discuss what caused the failure of the Ingenuity helicopter on Mars. Enjoy. All right, I'd like to welcome everybody back to this edition of the Observer's Notebook podcast. And today we have a special guest, Jack Daleo. He's a reporter covering the flying beat for Flying Magazine. He writes on topics like drones, unmanned aircraft systems, advanced mobility, and space travel. Welcome to the podcast, Jack.
It's a pleasure to be here, Tim. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Now, how long have you been writing for Flying Magazine?
I've been here a little bit under 2 years. And before that, I was at Freight Waves, which is similar. It's about logistics, a trade publication.
Okay.
And I've been with Flying for about 2 years now. Like you said, I cover a bunch of different things, but they're all kind of in the emerging technology space.
Okay. Are you a pilot or basically an author?
I'm just an author. I've flown a couple simulators, but that's the extent of my piloting experience.
Okay. Well, what brought you to my attention was an article in Astronomy Magazine where you went into an investigation and the cause of the Mars Ingenuity helicopter failing on Flight 72. And I saw that in my background with NASA. I dealt a lot with root cause analysis and things like that. And we've always had, when you do a failure analysis, it's nice to have the hardware in front of you where you can examine it. And I was like, well, how did they do this on something that's so far away? And we'll get into that. But first, what can you tell us about Ingenuity and what its purpose was and basically the design, if you know any of that?
Yeah. So a Martian helicopter. It sounds pretty out there, but it's real. It exists. It's called Ingenuity. And it's the first aircraft to ever achieve Howard-controlled flight of another planet, Mars. That was developed by NASA JPL, the Jet Propulsion Lab, with some help from the Ames and Langley Research Centers, Aerovironment, and a few others. So Ingenuity launched to Mars in 2020, arrived there with NASA's Perseverance rover, which is actually still up there collecting samples. And Ingenuity was designed for 5 experimental test flights. NASA thought those would take about a month to complete. It has ended up flying 72 missions over more than 3 years. It's covered 30 times more ground than NASA thought it would. It had an intended range of 980 feet, but its record was 2,000. Its flight altitude, was supposed to be about 15 feet. Ultimately, it reached 79 feet. So at first, the goal was to kind of prove that it was possible to fly on Mars, but the mission eventually sort of morphed into demonstrating real, actual operations like scouting flights for the Perseverance rover. So this was it was a massive overperformer for NASA.
Yeah, which is good. A lot of space missions are that way. I was on the Spirit and Opportunity, and I think those were just the last 90 days, and they lasted quite a bit longer.
Yeah, and it's NASA certainly loves to see that happen. And this was one of those cases where they got way more than they intended out of this tech.
Yeah. Now, what was the mission objective for it? Just to see how far it could fly?
At first, yeah, basically the goal was just to see, is flight possible on another planet? And then once we found out, yes, it is, it was to see, what more can we do? How far can we fly? How fast can we fly? How high? What kinds of locations can we explore and examine? And that's, partially how we got into the situation where Ingenuity crashed. Is it left the environment that it was originally designed for.
Yeah, I know when we test hardware in NASA, a lot of times we test to see what breaks it, and that's basically what happened here. They took it to its limit, probably.
Pretty much, yeah. Like I said, 72 flights. That's a ton of time for things to go right and a ton of time for things to go wrong. And let's talk about the navigation system for Ingenuity here, because I think that's key to what went wrong.
Okay.
So just to kind of give a little overview, this nav system, it tracks features on the Martian surface using a camera that's attached to the bottom of Ingenuity. It points straight down, and it's designed for flat areas that are, in NASA's words, also well textured or pebbly.
Okay.
So lots of rocks, lots of landmarks for these cameras to be able to keep track of. And the system is supposed to basically avoid any obstacles and help Ingenuity pick its own landing spot without any human interaction at all. So this nav system also has a rangefinder that points a laser at the ground to measure altitude, and something called an inertial measurement unit, and that measures acceleration. So this is kind of the key tech that was the focus of the investigation.
Okay. Now, who was involved with the investigation?
I don't know the specific NASA team off the top of my head, but I know the NASA JPL folks were involved in this.
Okay. Yeah, they're the ones that built and designed the thing and tested it.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. So, do you know the limitations of the Ingenuity's? It's basically like a vision navigation system, right? To encounter the terrain.
Yeah. So you've got the vision aspect with the cameras, and then you've also got this IMU, inertial measurement unit, to track acceleration. Basically, that helps scientists know how the spacecraft or how the helicopter is oriented, what direction it's moving, things like that.
Okay. Now, prior to Flight 72, were there indications that things were getting shaky on it?
There were some early signs, yeah. So Ingenuity made a total of 3 emergency landings in those 3 years.
Okay.
Like I said, it was designed for 5 missions. Those were supposed to take place in the Martian spring. Obviously, its lifespan extended into the winter, and that actually caused a navigation sensor called an inclinometer to stop working. So that inclinometer, it's not active during flight, but it is used to kind of figure out how Ingenuity is oriented on the ground.
Okay.
And that's essential for the navigation system to work. So NASA, they managed to run a software patch through to that inertial measurement unit that I mentioned. Essentially, that software patch is replicating what the inclinometer does. So they were able to fix that issue that happened on Flight 28. And from Flight 29 on, there were 3 emergency landings, like I said. However, the most recent of those was actually on Flight 71, which is the mission before the crash happened. So it had to make an emergency landing because the navigation system had some issues because the terrain below had sand dunes and didn't have many rocks.
Yeah.
So it had trouble basically picking out the terrain below.
Okay, now when it makes an emergency land, I don't know. Do you know the process for that? Do they just actually it's autonomous? So does the helicopter just say, "Oh, I have a problem here. I've got to set myself down"?
It's a great question. My understanding is that if it is having trouble picking out features on the ground, basically an automatic emergency landing would be triggered.
Okay.
And we can get into why that failed during Flight 72.
Okay. All right. Well, can you give us the specifics of Flight 72, the sequence of events that took place up until the failure?
So Flight 71, like I mentioned, was an emergency landing.
Mhm.
NASA didn't know where Ingenuity landed. So
Oh,
Flight 72 was meant to determine its location, test out some systems, and take a few photos.
okay.
So Ingenuity flew to about 40 feet, hovered for about 4.5 seconds, and after about 19 seconds, it started falling. After 32 seconds, it was back on the surface, and NASA lost communications with Perseverance, which was the communications relay for Ingenuity. So for a few days, they had no idea what happened because uh, this happened millions of miles away from Earth, right?
Right.
There's
Right.
no black boxes. There
Hmm.
are no outside cameras that you can use to snap photos of it. But NASA was able to get comms back the next day, and about 6 days later, Ingenuity beamed down some photos, and that is what the NASA investigative team is using to piece together its assessment of what happened. So, if you remember, I mentioned that Ingenuity's cameras they are designed to pick up features on terrain that's flat and pebbly or well textured. By Flight 72, it was flying over a crater.
Ah.
There were steep walls, sand dunes that were decidedly not pebbly. So when it was in the air, after about 20 seconds, it simply just ran out of features to track.
Hmm. Wow. And now, did the systems did they respond automatically when it did that?
Yeah, so basically the so NASA knew that something was wrong, um, but the system failed because of the landscape that Ingenuity was flying in. So the navigation system it's also responsible for estimating velocity, like I mentioned.
Hmm.
Um, and so, based on the photos that show damage to Ingenuity's rotor blades, once that system failed, NASA thinks that it hit a sand dune while it was still flying
Oh.
and moving very fast at a horizontal speed. And that is what caused it to begin rolling. And now these are pretty big blades.
Hmm.
They're about 4 feet from tip to tip,
Okay.
but they are not designed to handle that kind of, violent rotation after an impact like that. So all 4 of these blades, they snapped off about a third of the way from the tip, which is their weakest point. And after that, the rotor system started shaking and one of the blades snapped off at the root. And that is what caused the communications blackout.
Okay. Now,
That, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
you said they have photos of the blades that have snapped off.
We do. You can actually find them on NASA's website.
Okay. Now, those are photos from the helicopter itself.
Yes, photos
Okay.
from the helicopter where you can see the blades in view.
Okay. Crazy. Wow.
Yeah, so they basically managed to piece together a rough profile of what happened just using those photos. And I should note that this is a preliminary assessment, and NASA
Hmm.
is going to put out something more detailed. In December, they said that would come out in the next few weeks. It's not out yet, but
Hmm.
uh, it's pretty remarkable that they're able to, piece
It's
something together like this, millions and millions of miles away.
and that's what intrigued me when I read your article. I'm like, how did they do this? Because there's no witness samples to examine. There's nothing else. It's just the data and a few photographs.
Yeah, no, it's NASA does a lot of incredible things every day, but
Yes, yes, I do.
this is absolutely. To me, sticks out as one of them.
Mm. So, was the design of the rotor blades, was that a design flaw, or is it just a structural vulnerability that they had there, where they snapped off?
I wouldn't call it a flaw necessarily, because normally when Ingenuity is operating, it's not pitching and rolling and
Hmm.
violently rotating toward the ground. That's not part of its flight envelope. So I wouldn't call it a structural failure.
Okay. Have they released any lessons learned for future flights or future designs of helicopters yet?
Yeah, they have come out with a bunch.
Mm.
Um, so just to preface this, Ingenuity was actually kind of a long time coming. The first prototype flights on Earth happened in 2016, about 5 years before it actually flew on Mars. And NASA said that the difficulty of that first attempt at a flight on Mars was like, I've got a quote in front of me here, like trying to do regular commercial passenger service with the right flyer in 1903.
Mm.
Just because the difference between the tech demonstrator that they flew on Earth
Hmm.
and the actual science flight is so huge.
Hmm.
So scientists were already, expecting to get tons and tons of data from actually flying on another planet. But the fact that this thing flew for 3 years,
Yeah.
it gives them a ton of insight into, future Mars helicopters. Um, we can talk about some of those if you like.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Yeah. I mean, I worked for NASA for a number of years, and very few things really got me excited as much as this helicopter did, because it's just something we had never done before. And I had seen the mock-ups of it at JPL, and I'm like, this is going to fly in a Martian atmosphere. Okay, let's see this happen, And yeah, tell me about what we're going to be changing or working on in the future.
Oh, it really is just the beginning. You can even see just over the course of the 3 years that Ingenuity flew, the kinds of improvements that were able to be made. Flight one, for example, that was just a 9 foot up and down hover
Hmm.
flight. There was no forward flight or anything like that. That didn't happen until flight two, and it flew at about half a meter per second. Not fast,
Hmm.
but by flight 10, it was at 40-foot altitude, flying at 11 miles per hour. Uh, Eventually got to 79-foot altitude and 22 and a half miles per hour. So we see the progress on Ingenuity itself,
Hmm.
but then looking ahead to the future, uh, NASA right now, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, has Perseverance up on Mars collecting samples. They are trying to get those samples back, and
Hmm.
one way that that might happen is by using something called a Martian sample recovery helicopter. So basically, what NASA's planning to do is kind of build on Ingenuity's design, uh, and these would serve as backups for Perseverance if Perseverance can't collect samples
Okay.
successfully.
All right.
So Ingenuity could inform the aircraft that are responsible for bringing the first ever samples back from another planet.
That seems like a good way to do it instead of having to drive a rover all over the place to pick up the samples. That seems
Right, and
like,
that's kind of the goal of having something like this, right? It's to do things that rovers can't. Um, and like for example, another thing that NASA tested is something called system identification or SysID. So for the first time, that let them get a really accurate look at flight dynamics for an aircraft on another planet.
hmm.
That's huge
Hmm.
for developing new models, right? Because we can't fully recreate those conditions on Earth. And now that that technology has been validated, you could put that on future Martian helicopter, say the sample retriever helicopter, and NASA could use that to pick out any flaws with the flight dynamics early on in the mission and keep that thing flying.
Hmm.
So there's just so much to learn, and Ingenuity is still active. It's still beaming weather and avionics data to Perseverance about once a week.
Oh wow,
So yeah, so that weather data could help with future Mars explorations.
interesting. I didn't know it was still active. That's wild. That's wild. So, what else do you have to share with us about the ingenuity or the findings?
Well, they are kind of already using the findings to develop Ingenuity's successor. So that avionics data that I mentioned. NASA is using that because Ingenuity, it was the first mission to fly with commercial off-the-shelf cell phone processors in deep space. And since it lasted so much longer than expected, NASA is using that avionics data to try to recreate that, to try to use, smaller, lighter components for future Mars helicopters. And the project manager for Ingenuity, his name is Teddy Xanatos, and
Okay.
a few other people from that team. They're already building a new model. It's called the Mars Chopper. That would be about the size of an SUV.
Oh my
It'd be about
goodness.
yeah, about 20 times heavier than Ingenuity, and it'd be able to carry a lot more equipment. To be able to cover 2 miles a day is the goal. For comparison, Ingenuity's longest flight was under half a mile. So that's something that's still really, really early in development. It's in
Uh-huh.
the design concept phase, but the idea here is to be able to build on what those rovers can do, go to places they can't go.
Hmm. That's interesting. Yeah, that's a fascinating way to explore a planet is just by flying around because we've always had the rover mentality. That's the way to do it, and that's wild. I like that. So, you've written a number of articles for Flying Magazine. I've gone through your bio and read a number of them. What's your what's your passion with flying?
That's a great question. A great question. Not to be a homer, but I do love writing about space flight.
Mm,
I think it's a really fascinating time for space flight right now because, NASA has really sort of shifted to, you know, contracting commercial companies to
hmm.
make things happen. You've got private space missions happening right now.
Right.
The the Polaris Dawn mission, for example. Um, Not sure if your listeners are familiar, but that was a mission that happened a few months ago. It was purchased from SpaceX by Jared Isaacman, who's actually President Donald Trump's pick to lead NASA. Um, and that flight had the first ever private spacewalk happen.
Hmm.
So we're just seeing so much movement happen on the space front, and I think it's so exciting.
It really is, and just seeing what the Starship is going to be capable of doing in the future as well. I mean, I've never seen a rocket that big. I mean, that's
Oh yeah, I mean, who knows? Maybe that'll be the next kind of spacecraft to fly on Mars. That's
yeah,
uh,
that's the
that's
plan.
the goal for that Elon Musk has set, right? Is to
Hmm.
eventually establish a colony on Mars. Um, but to get there, yeah, it's going to take a while to get there.
Hmm.
Um, you know, something else that's super fascinating in space right now is that Starship flight test program.
Hmm.
Um, the the booster catch that happened a few months ago. I'm not sure if you.
The chopsticks.
Oh yeah, the chopstick booster
Yeah,
catch.
yeah.
Um,
They've done a
it's just
couple of them now.
unbelievable.
Yeah, yeah. That's more than Buck Rogers at that point. That's like yeah, it's kind of wild to see things like that occur.
And to pull it off on the first attempt is just it's something else.
Yeah,
And now we've got another potentially reusable rocket coming in New Glenn from
right,
Blue Origin.
right. They just had a successful launch not too long ago.
They did. The fact that they even it's impressive, and
Yeah.
the fact that these things are now flying, I just think the pace is going to pick up so
Oh,
quickly.
oh yeah. There's a SpaceX launch every other day. I mean, I live here in Southern California, and I can see the launches from Vandenberg from my front yard. It's pretty wild.
That must be absolutely magical.
It,
I
it,
can't
it's
even imagine.
if they launch it at the right time of night, they have what they call the jellyfish effect, where the plume just takes up half the sky. It's unbelievable.
Now, how close did they let you get to those?
Well, we live about 100 miles south of Vandenberg Air Force Base, so we have a good view of it. I mean, if they launch it like at dusk, and it's quite an impressive sight. And going there, well, I launched some of our NASA satellites from Vandenberg, so if you're not working on it, you can't be on base, obviously, and they clear out, I think, a 25-mile radius. Vandenberg when they have rocket launches, just in case. But it's fascinating to watch and fascinating to work up there. So, what are your what interesting future articles do you have coming up?
Well, the big topic right now for flying is this this DC mid-air collision that happened.
Mm,
It's going to obviously raise a lot of questions about the national airspace system. Um, Beyond that, NASA's Artemis program is definitely top of mind, especially with Jared Isaacman potentially coming in and taking over as NASA administrator. I actually did a piece for Flying Magazine, our print magazine, about the potential impacts of someone like Isaacman, who
hmm
he doesn't bring any government experience, right? But he's an interesting person because he is a private astronaut. He's flown to space twice, both with SpaceX,
hmm
and he clearly has a passion for this industry and a business sense that he brings to it.
Yeah, the whole I started my NASA career with Boeing as a contractor there, and just if I can speak for myself, the Boeing today is not the NASA Boeing I worked with years ago, and they've got a lot of problems going on. And the Artemis mission, the capsule, everything involved with that, there's concerns from inside and outside of NASA. I know that.
Yeah, Artemis at this point is it's kind of a crapshoot
Yeah.
because it was delayed twice last year. So first from September 25 to September 26, and now to mid 2027. Uh, it's billions of dollars over budget.
hmm
Um, there have been suggestions from some folks in the industry about potentially canceling the SLS, which
hmm
is, the designated vehicle for Artemis,
Right.
or at least the first handful of missions. So there's a lot of uncertainty right now. And you add to that the budget that
hmm
NASA is dealing with.
hmm
Um, the proposed budget, it's pretty flat in terms of keeping up with inflation.
Right.
So it's going to maybe limit what NASA can do and maybe force it to, keep exploring what its commercial partners like SpaceX, Boeing, Blue Origin, all the rest of them can do. Because, when you're working with sort of a constrained budget, um, sometimes it's more efficient to outsource. So it's just a bit of a crossroads that NASA faces right now with Artemis.
Yeah. NASA doesn't have the innovation that I think they once had. And that's being taken up by Bezos and Musk. I mean, they're the ones on the cutting edge now. I mean, Artemis is basically a refurbished, shuttle engines and hardware. I mean, I remember the first time I ever saw a SpaceX. One of the first times I saw a SpaceX launch, they got down to zero. They hit the button, rocket engines ignited, and then 2 seconds later they shut them down. 15 minutes later, they reignited the engines, put the thing in orbit. Now, could NASA do that? Absolutely not. There's no way. I would have had 3 months worth of paperwork to fill out, you know, being able to launch a rocket, shut the engines down, and then turn around and then decide to launch it again. So it's at that point I knew we were in a whole different ballgame. And
Yeah,
it's
and I think it makes sense too because if you're working with people's tax dollars, obviously there's going to be less tolerance for
yes,
failure.
yeah. Well, my job with NASA was mission assurance, so that's I know the one that looked at all that paperwork and everything, and I know people that worked for SpaceX, and we don't have that there. That's what they would tell me. So it's just, and they've been really lucky. They haven't lost anybody. They haven't had any major failures. So it's yeah,
Yeah. How about Starliner?
yeah.
Didn't go as planned.
Nope.
For listeners who aren't aware, Starliner is that's Boeing's spacecraft. It's designed as kind of the alternative to SpaceX's Dragon to transport crews to and from the ISS. Uh, and that program is now facing major delays. It wasn't able to return the astronauts
Yeah,
after
Butch and Sonny
bringing
still
them to
haven't
the
come down.
ISS.
Yeah, they're
They're
still up
still
there.
up there.
Yeah.
They'll be up there for at least another month, potentially two, depending on when SpaceX Crew 10 can launch.
Yeah, that'll be coming up on a year. I mean, it was supposed to be what, a 2-week mission at that?
8 days, I
8 days.
believe,
That's right. That's right.
was the timeline, and
Yeah.
we're at about 8 months now.
Yeah.
So,
well, I'm sure Butch and Sonny are having a good time up there. They're lifer astronauts, so they've been around the block. They worked with NASA for a number of years, so I'm sure it's
yeah, no, it definitely frustrates me to see, the stranded phrasing that goes around sometimes, because these, they're prepared. Obviously it's not ideal to
no,
to have a mission extend for that long, but they're prepared for things like this, and NASA does a great job of keeping the station stocked with food and supplies. They're able to talk to their friends and families. I've done a few stories about how Butch and Sonny voted in this past presidential election. That they've had Thanksgiving and Christmas celebrations up there.
Yeah.
So it's not paradise. It's Florida or Hawaii, but
right.
they'll be okay.
But for two astronauts to be stuck up there for as long as they have, that's a pretty good duo. I mean, those are professional astronauts, and I'm sure they're disappointed they're not home yet, but they're rolling with it.
Absolutely. They're probably two of the best people for the job.
I agree completely. Wow. Okay. We're way off topic, but interesting conversation, Jack. I mean, is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience before we move out?
Well, if you're, interested in some of the topics that we just talked about, I cover them all for flying. You can follow me on X at Jack_Daleo, and that's where you can find a link to my newsletter. It's called The Future of Flying. It goes out every Thursday, and it covers stories just like the one we talked about with the Ingenuity Mars helicopter, Starliner, SpaceX, all of your space flight, drone, advanced air mobility topics. You could find them there.
Great. Well, Jack, I really want to thank you for coming on the podcast today.
Yeah, Tim, thanks again for having me.
All right. Well, that'll do it for this episode of the Observer's Notebook podcast. Interesting conversation with Jack. I hope you guys have a chance to really dig into some of his articles. I've got a link to this article that I based this interview on, but you can also see a lot of his others. Jack Daleo, great guy, wealth of information, and I really want to thank Jack for coming on the podcast today. We upload new episodes of the Observer's Notebook on the 1st and 15th of every month. You can subscribe to us on iTunes. If you do, please give us a rating and a review. I'd really appreciate it. You can also listen to us on Apple Radio, iHeartRadio, SoundCloud, Spreaker, Google Play, Stitcher, Amazon Echo, Spotify, and the podcast is also available on the Association of Lunar Planetary Observers YouTube channel. You can support the podcast by donating to it via Patreon, where you can give up to $35 a month, where you'll receive 1 year's membership to the Alpo and producer credits on the podcast. And with that, I'd like to thank producers of this podcast, Steve Siedentop and Michael Moyer, for their continuous, generous support of the podcast. Thank you very much, gentlemen. The link for Patreon, as well as the link for the Alpo, is in the show notes. If you'd like to get a hold of me, my email address is cometman@cometman.net. And until next time, I hope as you always have clear and steady skies. Thanks for listening.